Hello, it's nice to see you all taking part in our webinar. We're starting sharp, as always, I hope. So today we're going to discuss a paper written by Krzysztof Kutwa from our institute. Krzysztof works at the strategy team. This is one of our teams which focuses on many different kinds of topics and analysis, which are not covered, or they go between the chairs, as they say, between the cracks. It's something that not just one certain group is interested in. And today presented paper, or the paper presented today by Krzysztof, is one of those cases. So it's a paper written on the Corona generation, on the young people. They're struggling today with the education system, with hybrid education, with the catalysts of digitalization within their lives. At the same time, the teachers are struggling too. In Poland, but in many other countries, it is the young people who lost their jobs because of the Corona crisis. They were working in the service sector, basically shut down as of March last year. So this is also one of the groups which is going to be scarred with the economic factors of the crisis, not only of the education ones. And then there is the third one, also described in our paper, connected with the mental health and the psychological stability of young people, of their anxieties, of their problems. Those topics were vastly covered within the many fields, and many other institutions and scholars were discussing them before. Our analysts were thinking how to combine all this research which was conducted, and also give this issue a more general, give this a more general overview, give it a more general, show a more general approach in order to do something about the problem when going out of the crisis. So this is me. I just wanted to say that I find this topic one of the most important factors of the Corona crisis and its aftermath. And I hope that the presentation we are going to see right now from Krzysztof, and then a panel of I think, very interesting guests from around the globe, from America, from Poland, but also from Brussels. Schultz, you're in Brussels, or yes, so we have people from different countries. Not that easy to meet on a normal occasion. Currently, thanks to the general technological breakthrough of the COVID-19 and the Zoom conferences, it's possible. So I hope that you're all interested in the topic, and I hope you find this presentation from Krzysztof interesting. Krzysztof, over to you. And unmute yourself.
Hello, thank you for your presence. It's my pleasure to present you the result of calculation about so-called generation, as Piotr said, and saying, saying precisely, the paper aims to estimate the cost generated by COVID-19 in 2020 among young people and forecast short-term and long-term expenses. It measures the Corona generation's past and future situation in 3 dimensions: education, mental health, and labor market. Due to the choice of this area, the focus is on the young people broadly understood, from the first school years to employees who are relatively still young, up to 34 years of age. Knowing about who we are talking about, let's take a closer look at each of the COVID impact areas. First, education. Here we conducted the analysis based on 6 steps. Firstly, the paper draws of the findings of 2 scientists, Montenegro and Patrinos, on the country's return to schooling by gender and education attainment. In the first step, we focused also on adding the missing data on the return to education. Gaps in the data were filled based on comparative analysis, where major characteristics refer to the level of development and location. Secondly, we use a database on the scale of closure of education entities around the world, created by UNESCO. It includes information on government decision on education from mid-February 2020. The UNESCO dataset enabled the calculation of the ratios of lost return to schooling for each country, assuming that it is a function of the share of remote classes in the total number of classes. Moreover, what is important, and we assumed at this step that remote lessons are 75% as effective as traditional classes. This is reasonable according to the literature. Thirdly, the paper incorporated research result on the nominal financial returns to education for a man or a woman and by education level. The missing values were approximated by spending on education as a percentage of GDP. As the fourth step, respecting gender differences also and education attainment for expected cost due to the COVID-19, and the ratios estimated in the second step for each country were used to estimate the long-term net financial returns lost, or in other words, the global lost earnings among young people resulting from the impact of the pandemic on education. The fifth step involved adjusting the output by the level of youth unemployment and the fact that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. We applied the discount rate of 3%. Finally, the present value of lost earnings was calculated. To better present the data, the results were converted into total loss of earnings during 45 years career, global and regional annual losses and individual loss expressed per year and life cycle, bearing in mind gender differences and education. Let's check the results. On average, young people's future earnings will be an estimated 6.2% lower due to the impact of COVID-19 on education. Nominally, young people in education during the crisis will lose $550 a year in earnings as employees in the future. If every young person employed in the future is counted, the annual global wage loss will reach 465 billion, over 0.5% of global GDP. Taking into consideration the whole working life cycle, it is 45 years, COVID-19 will result in young people earnings almost 21 trillion less. What we proposed here to tackle with negative impact. First of all, maintain government spending on education and regain lost time. The crisis is expected to lead to budget cuts, and education could lose a lot. Some predict massive cuts in education budgets. This will expose global achievement in terms of access to education and global efforts to improve learning outcomes. We may have to consider public-private partnerships and encourage private sponsors to support each level of education in a different formula. We could also think about incentives for students to stay at school, such as scholarships, conditional money transfer, and savings programs to encourage learning. In addition, it is important to prepare an education catch-up plan. At the school level, this should be done taking into account local distinction and lost knowledge, skills, and competences. Second of all, revise the education model, because the pandemic has highlighted the weaknesses of all the education system in the world. At least one common point we can indicate: the mismatch between the educational offer and market needs. A profound reform of education model with less theoretical knowledge and more focus on practical skills will respond to the problem of the easy replacement of employees. Third of all, invest in digital skills and technology. The unique and outstanding nature of the crisis means that not only better educated people, but also those in jobs and professions are more likely to work remotely and perform better. Most of the time, they are people with digital skills. Therefore, equipping people with digital skills has suddenly become a critical need. Even professions such as primary school teachers, music teachers, personal fitness trainers, and service providers who may never have had to connect remotely before had to connect with others online. Offering short training courses to improve digital skills will help. Governments have also started to subsidize internet access or supply cheap computers to people without access to technology. That's all when it comes to the education. Let's move on to the second dimension, health, or saying precisely mental health. Here we also have 6 steps. The first involves calculation based on the 3 broad categories: impact on health spending, social spending, and the labor market. This approach was used because the total cost of mental health problems are huge, highlighting the need for greater efforts to prevent mental illness and provide timely and effective treatment when it occurs. The second step relied on the data set showing the total direct and indirect cost of mental health in OECD countries. In our study, the direct costs include both those borne by healthcare system as they threat mental health problem and additional social security spending, including paid sick leave, disability benefits, and unemployment benefits. The indirect costs relate to the labor market impact of mental health problem and include both lower employment rates among young people with mental health problems and lower productivity due to higher absenteeism and lower productivity at work. In the third step, comparative analysis was used to estimate the total cost of mental disorders globally. Countries' current health spending served as a proxy of mental health cost. As a consequence, the estimated direct cost, healthcare costs, are based on the selection of mental health conditions contained in a previous study on the cost of disorders of the brain. The original cost estimates were extrapolated to 2020 using recent healthcare spending data and updated macroeconomic data. The fourth step involved estimating COVID-19 impact on the increase in 2 types of direct cost of mental health. To this end, World Health Organization research results were used to show that more than 60% of entities reported disruption in the provision of mental health service for vulnerable people, including children and adolescents, the elderly also, and women in need of antenatal and postnatal care. Moreover, 67% saw disruption in counseling and psychotherapy, 65% for critical harm reduction services, and 45% for opioid agonist maintenance treatment of opioid dependence. Those values were used to estimate the direct cost for health system. The second category of direct cost, social benefits, was presented based on the fact that 30% reported disruption in access to drugs for mental, neurological, and substance use disorders. The fifth step estimated COVID-19's impact on the increase in indirect cost of mental health problems. It was based on the data retrieved from the available literature. The article which we found notes a decrease in life satisfaction, which directly affects the situation on the labor market. In other words, a suitable proxy of an increase in indirect cost due to the COVID-19 was assumed to be a change in life satisfaction. The sixth step was gather data on the share of young people in a given country based on the assumption that the COVID-19 related mental health costs among young people were proportionally related to the share of young generation in the population. The result was the increase in direct and indirect mental health costs in the young generation due to the COVID-19. Moving on, the key results, the overall annual increase in cost due to the COVID-19 related mental health problem among young people is estimated as a 0.5% of GDP worldwide. Nominally, this equates to the more than 400 billion, saying more precisely, $185 billion in direct spending on the health system, almost 80 billion on social security programs, and further 142 billion in indirect costs related to lower employment and productivity. Recommended solution. First, it is extending government spending on mental health. Limited access to psychiatric care and addiction treatment is partially caused by the current shortage of mental health professionals, which is likely to be exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Since the beginning of the pandemic, there has been an increase in mental health services provided through telemedicine. These efforts must be constantly improved and the IT system developed to handle the growing number of patients efficiently. At the same time, the employment of psychological healthcare specialists has to increase. There should be an attempt to address the scarcity of psychiatric care personnel by providing virtual coaching, mentoring, and educational content. This is particularly important where people with pre-pandemic mental health and substance use disorder and those who are newly affected or likely to need mental health and substance use services. An emotional support hotline should be launched and health insurers should be required to forego ongoing cost for in-house psychiatric care. Second, recommendation, it is increasing the number of mental disorder specialists at schools and universities. Why? Those people are the closest to young people and could react quickly to disturbing changes in their lives. It is worth remembering scientific results and improving the scanning of high-risk individuals in the population. The mental health and the emergency management communities should work together to identify, develop, and spread evidence-based resources related to mental health following disaster, mental health selection and referral, special populations needs and death notification and sorrow care. There is broad knowledge on this issue. One study echoes previous one, showing that women are more likely to develop depression and or anxiety. Study results played an important role in guiding online psychological intervention before and during the outbreak. So schools authorities should consider adding elements to self-awareness in their curricula, including meditation. There is growing evidence that suggests that meditation has a positive effect on symptoms of anxiety. And the third recommendation, provide economic aid and security. People experiencing job loss and income insecurity are particularly at risk of experiencing potential long-term mental health effects. An analysis by the Wellbeing Trust and Robert Graham Center for Policy Studies shows that there could be an additional 75,000 deaths from suicide and alcohol or drug abuse in the US by 2029 due to the economic downturn. health-related interventions should be therefore be combined and getting along with labor market policies and strategies to address the probable increase in demand for mental health services. States should consider legislation providing economic assistance and security in the context of COVID-19. Such provisions could alleviate the urgent need for remote mental health and substance use services. The regulations should be supplemented with a fund that would extend the scope and availability of telehealth and other remote care for insured patients. Impact of COVID-19 on labor market. There is 6 steps also. First of all, it was based on the International Labor Organization's data on working hours, hour losses. Those, as estimated using the ILO nowcasting model, are an aggregate indicator of the labor market impact of the COVID-19 crisis. The factors driving such losses depend on country-specific labor market outcomes during the pandemic, with policy implication for the recovery process. The second step involved calculating change in the unemployment rate in 2020 among young people in the 15 to 34 age group. It results in the number of young people having become unemployed because of COVID-19. The third step used information on a country's average monthly salary by gender, adjusting the data to the right age group. Based on the literature, the percentage assumed was 75%. Of average monthly salary. The fourth step combined the information on the increase in youth unemployed due to the COVID-19 and the adjusted salary. As a result, the short-term costs for young people in 2020 caused by COVID-19 were estimated. In the fifth step, based on the estimated consequences of previous crises, a long-term analysis of the future earnings lost by young people was conducted. In this context, the literature indicates that starting one's working life during a recession can affect labor market entrance for years. Literature says that the large initial impact on labor supply and wages tends to disappear after 10 to 15 years on the labor market. We adopted here 15 years. Here we also used 3% discount rate. The sixth step used figures on the young population adjusted by the country's employment rate, as well as the average salary adjusted by age. It also drew on the result of available research on the value of earning loss in the crisis, taking into account gender differences also. Combining all of the information, the expected long-term labor market consequences for young men and women were estimated and expressed as lost earnings. And what the results say? Well, COVID-19's short-term impact on the labor market cost young people $1.3 trillion in 2020, while the long-term impact over 15 years will reach $21 trillion globally. The deepest negative repercussion is in the short run, were felt in East Asia and the Pacific and North America. In contrast, the lowest 2020 impact was observed in the Middle East and North Africa and South Asia. It was higher in Sub-Saharan Africa as well as in Europe and Central Asia. The long-term losses caused by the worsening permanent unemployment are over 15 trillion, while those caused by the decrease in earnings are almost $6 trillion. This means that wages will be around 4% lower. At the individual level, young employees will lose $1,610 a year on average. What are the proposals here? First, Youth Guarantee Scheme. It is recommended to provide all young people with a good opportunity in employment, further education, or an internship within 4 months of becoming unemployed or leaving formal education. Crucial action in area with high rates of youth unemployment is particularly important. The consequences of youth unemployment are not only economic, but also social, which creates the risk of democratic and social exclusion among young people. The possible consequences include a decline in social capital and an increase in far-right views and violence. As shown by scientists, high youth unemployment in peri-urban areas can result in a criminal or conflict subculture. For unemployed and already qualified young people, the Youth Guarantee Scheme should also serve as a job guarantee, which means that young people would gain their first job experience in the public or non-profit sector. Second recommendation, fiscal policy stimulus mode and reskilling tools. Counter-cyclical fiscal policy should be used to reduce youth unemployment during the crisis. Fiscal policy must react swiftly and significantly before the recession reduces the fiscal space even more. So far, fiscal policy has given due priority to income support for business and workers to help them survive until the restrictions are lifted. Once the recovery phase has started, fiscal policy will have to fully revert to the stimulus mode, supporting young people who are entering or re-entering education, training, or the workforce, especially those in the most affected groups. Previous recessions have shown that fiscal policy is likely to be more effective than tax breaks by increasing public spending. Well-designed and coordinated macroeconomic employment and social policies reinforce each other in supporting economic recovery and employment. As the hardest hit sectors absorb a high proportion of youth unemployment, they require that the country's vision for post-pandemic development include tools offering active support for young people in terms of reskilling and changing industry. Last but not least, extending support to enterprises and youth targeted wage subsidy programs. In the short term, loans to young entrepreneurs and youth cooperatives should focus on financial support as well as broader access to business development and coaching services to ensure that enterprises survive the crisis. Support should remove barriers that prevent young people from accessing the available programs. In the long term, young entrepreneurs will need help to adapt their businesses model based on changes in demand and to grab opportunities in emerging green sectors. They may include support for investment in ITC infrastructure, for improved online marketing and customer services, and the adoption of clean technologies. Decreased economic activity also open up new opportunities as economic recover. Innovative young people are in an excellent position to capitalize on the changes through startups and business development, although they will need a range of support services to do so. With the lifting of restrictions, wage subsidies reduce the cost of retaining, hiring, and training young people. Wage subsidies have proven to be effective in increasing the long-term employment prospects of young people, from higher skills, productivity, and employability to shifting young people's preferences and behavior. Extending work sharing systems subsidized reductions in working hours is essential to protect young workers. These kinds of measures should be available to all young workers, irrespective of the type of employment contract. Now it's time to sum up. Corona generation growing up in a pandemic report estimated the total cost of COVID-19 impact on the Corona generation based on the cost in 3 dimensions analyzed. 2 basic time perspectives were considered, short and long term. As regards short run costs, the paper presented the estimated cost of COVID-19 in 2020 relating to mental health and the pandemic's immediate impact on the increase in unemployment among young people. The results confirm that total demand for mental health services in the young generation increased by over $400 in the 2020. From the point of view of the short-term increase in the unemployment rate among young people, the lost earnings amount to $1.3 trillion. The analysis of long-term cost involved estimating the impact of COVID-19 on education and the labor market. For education, the paper estimated how the deterioration in schooling as a result of school closures would decrease future earnings by $23 trillion globally over the course of the 45-year working life cycle. For the labor market, total output was divided into 2 basic indicators. One refers to the increase in permanent unemployment due to the crisis. According to the estimates, almost $16 trillion will be lost over 15 years due to the COVID-19. The other indicator measured the decrease in earnings among young employees. Based on the calculation, young people will miss out on almost $6 trillion in earnings over the 15 years. All in all, the total long-term cost of COVID-19 for the young generation exceed $44 trillion. This is a picture that I wanted to briefly draw as a good starting point for discussion by special guests and experts also. Justyna Pokojska from DELAB and University of Warsaw, Zol Darvas, who is a senior fellow at Bruegel, and Ben Slay, senior economist at UNDP. Guys, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Christoph. So I guess it's us now. I don't know, Ben, if you could show yourself. I know it's the morning in America right now, so you're probably just out of bed. So sorry, sorry for organizing this discussion so early. But it's good that we have some people from Poland, but also from other European countries who tune in and are going to watch this discussion. As you probably heard, Christoph is himself one of the younger generation's finest, and he's very interested in what's going to happen with people who he studied with and also with the young people in the labor force in the European Union. So it's a very, that's why he's so I would say also emotionally attached to the subject, and I would say he drawn a very data-driven picture from the report that he made. Okay, so he did introduce you also. I'm free of one other thing I had to do. But I wanted to ask probably Justyna Pokojska from DELAB as the first commentator to this discussion. You commented on many occasions the circumstances the young people are now living in. We know that according to the paper written by Krzysztof, this cost of COVID-19 is the astronomical number of 44 trillion US dollars. But probably it's the education, which is the most important topic which should be in our key focus going out of the pandemic or still within the pandemic. So, in your opinion, what's the kind of issues that should be tackled, maybe on a more European, less global level? And feel free also to give some introductory comments, maybe to the paper.
Thank you, Piotr, for introduction, and thank you for invitation to this wonderful meeting and the occasion to talk about pandemic, not only in this medical aspect, because we are always talking about people who fell ill and how many of them are nowadays in Poland or in other countries, but this is a unique occasion to talk about other also social costs of the pandemic. Christoph already indicated many ideas that can be done, or many ideas that can be tackled. How can we cope with this crisis, with this educational crisis that we are now in? So I will start with a general reflection on the pandemic of COVID-19 right now in education, especially because I think that we treat pandemic as the only one factor that led to this economical or educational crisis, and especially about education I would like to tell right now. And I would rather take a look on the context, because I'm only a sociologist, I'm not an economist, so all the numbers that you indicated are really vast, but I think that the social costs are the most vivid ones for me, especially as a sociologist, as a researcher. And we talk about pandemic, about this cost, but coming back to 2019, just a year before the outbreak of pandemic in Poland, we must indicate that our system of education was in a very special situation. We were just after withdrawn of two important reforms, one with 6-year-old pupils who were pulled back to kindergartens. The second one was about the secondary school and about the system of gymnasiums and other schools. And it was one kick, so to say, to our system of education. So it was weakened already by these reforms. Then we had the strikes and the protests of teachers. So the situation was also critical, not because of pandemic itself, but because of the atmosphere with the education in Poland. And it was a really hard situation. And then came the outbreak of the pandemic. And it was maybe not the most important factor here, but it was, I think, the nail in the coffin, so to say, the critical point, which exposed and bared all the inequalities or the costs that we must count in right now. And talking about inequalities, especially during a pandemic, we cannot forget about people who are inside the system. Me as a sociologist, I focus on people, on students, on pupils, on teachers and parents who are involved in this system of education. Of course, these economical costs are immense. But once I've read that the biggest cost of our pandemic here in Poland is the pandemic of loneliness, of being alone, of being out of the system. And only in Warsaw in 2020, in May, as I remember, more than 1,000 pupils just disappeared from the system. And I think that we must remember about this every single student who just disappeared somehow during this pandemic. And of course, what we can do right now is to think about the people that are inside the system and try to prepare the program of support, of financial support. Christoph noted in this report that we should maintain the governmental support. I do fully agree, but I think that the problem is with the drift of responsibility, because the decisions are made on the very high level of governmental decisions and issues, but they are implemented on the low level of headmasters, of directors of the local schools. And I think that the disproportions between the schools in our system are so vivid that we should tailor this program of support very wisely. And before we tailor the program, before we go to the schools, let's make a research, let's make a study. You've researched all the indicators, all the numbers, but I would like to encourage my colleagues, my sociological colleagues, to study the situation in school, the situation situation in families, because according to the data, just let me give a few examples. 10% of pupils during the pandemic had no internet access at all. So it's not a surprise that they disappointed from the system of education during this year. Furthermore, 17 or 18% had no equipment at home. Almost 900,000 pupils had no place at home to learn remotely. So I think these are the most important issues right now, and we should tackle with them and cope with this problem. So tailor a program, of course, based on our knowledge, on our research, on our studies, but focus also on pupils and teachers who were left alone. Once I read a very interesting sentence that on March the 11th or 12th, I don't remember precisely, the 21st century in Polish education started, according to the opinion of the teachers, because then on the March the 12th or the 11th last year, we came to the situation that the remote learning, blended learning, or digital technologies were involved in our process of education. And it was the revolution, so to say, in our system of education. So what can we do right now? Not and I think that the revolution that has already started should be carried on, and we should observe, count, of course, research, study all the issues that are connected with this situation that we have right now with the pandemic 1 year after. But we are wiser right now. We are well prepared. We already know a lot. So just implement it into well-tailored programs of support, but coming from the bottom. So my approach will be bottom to the top, observing how it looks like at schools, how it looks like at homes, and pupils and teachers, how they cope with it. Only one last anecdote from my research. It was 2 or 3 years ago. We researched digital culture in Mazovian schools. We chose 5 or 10 schools in Mazovia district, and when we tried to research the already existing infrastructure and maturity, and the problem was not with equipment or without computers or not having enough this digital tables and other equipment, gadgets, technological. But the problem was that people were not mature enough and not aware how to use it and how to implement it in the process of education. And I think that many programs that we are now conducting, and sometimes the support that comes from the very general governmental level addresses, for example, the needs to buy new equipment, to buy new stuff, but we do not invest in human capital. We do not invest in upskilling teachers and pupils how to use it wisely and how to use this thing we already possess, but how to wisely revolutionize our system of education to profit also from the pandemic, because it's a crisis, but can be a chance also on the other hand.
Thank you very much, Justyna. I want to go to a more, so going from Poland to Europe as a whole, and I wanted to ask Zsoltdarvas on the issues connected with the fiscal response or the policy responses on the EU level that could be introduced in short term and long term. We saw the picture painted by Krzysztof as a long-term scarring effect of costs of the hypothetical lower income of those people who are entering the market or could be affected by the worse circumstances in terms of schooling currently. So I know that education is not a theme that the EU has any power on, and it cannot probably change that much, but it can, through a regulatory framework or probably some schemes that could be seen in the near future. How do you see that? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. And first of all, thank you for inviting me. So let me start with the flagship European policy, which is the European Pillar of Social Rights, which was proclaimed in 2017 by the European Parliament, the European Council, and the European Commission. This is not a hard law. This is a kind of a set of principles, 20 principles that European institutions consider important. and asked the member states to develop action plans. And let me mention the most important, or those elements, certainly all 20 principles are important, but those elements which are particularly relevant for the youth. Namely, I mean, the very first principle is education, training, and lifelong learning. The second one is gender equality, which is also absolutely important. And we have seen in the pandemic that women were impacted more than men. The third is equal opportunities. And the fourth one is active support for employment. Now, these are nice principles, but just a few days ago and earlier in March, an action plan has been adopted by the Commission, which has 3 flagship targets. And the first one is to increase the employment rate to population to 78%. Currently, it's about 72. So it means that currently 72% of working age people between 20 and 64 actually work. The goal is to raise it to 78. The second main target is lifelong learning, to achieve that at least 60%, so almost 2/3 of all adults will be participating in training every year. Currently, just 1/3 of adults are participating in such training, so it's a quite ambitious plan. And the third one is a reduction of an indicator which is called at risk of poverty or social exclusion by 15 million. Now, how do these targets relate to the youth generation, Corona generation that Christoph has presented? I think Christoph very nicely highlighted the potential risks and the losses that are coming from education and unemployment. Now, I mean, these targets clearly aim to compensate for them to some extent, because, I mean, Christoph mentioned that, for example, remote education is about 25% less effective than on-site in-person education. But, if after completing, some years remotely, at an adult age, still young people can benefit from continued trainings as the European Action Plan targets, then certainly that can help a lot. And last but not least, I mean, increasing the employment rate significantly would also major benefit also for the young children, not young children, but young people, partly because also in our research, we also found that young people were affected more than older people during last year due to job losses resulted from the pandemic. So if member states will be able to promote a higher level of employment, then in fact that can benefit young people more. Now, coming to your question, what national policies should do? Now, every country should now prepare a plan on how they want to achieve these goals. And this is not so easy. I mean, Christoph made many good suggestions, and I very much agree. Certainly in terms of education, he called for a broad rethinking of the education system. He called for improvement in digital skills. Again, let me know how important it is. There are studies looking at job losses last year, depending on whether the particular job can be performed remotely or not. And not surprisingly, job losses were much more significant in tasks and occupations which cannot be done remotely, both in industries directly affected by the pandemic, like restaurants and tourism, but also in the industries which are not directly affected by the pandemic. Also, job losses are much more significant when such a job was not possible to do remotely. So again, improving digital skills and help remote work certainly is a very important initial step in addressing the labor market impact of the crisis. But certainly this can lead back to the mental health issue that both Justina and Christoph mentioned, that if people are just working from home, especially if they have small apartments, no garden to go out for a walk or to get some fresh air, that can also lead to major mental health issues, which is a major concern. But certainly in the short term, until we get over the pandemic, supporting remote work in all possible means, including better infrastructure and internet access, is absolutely important, and this is a top priority of fiscal policy. And certainly in the longer term, a major education reform is absolutely necessary. Let me also drew some highlights of one of our other research that we have prepared for Eurofund, in which we looked at social mobility, which means that in briefly, what are the chances of people who were born in poorer households to reach a higher level of income after they grow up and start to work. And what we found is that family background is unfortunately a major determinant of later success in life. For example, if you look at how much gain a person has by completing university education instead of primary education, that's a big step. Imagine someone who just achieved a primary education, but instead that person goes to and completes a university. So what is the gain in her or his wealth during her lifetime? And what is the gain from an average inheritance received by those who receive inheritance? Not everyone receives, but some share of the society receives. Then we found that inheritance gives a bigger boost to future welfare, future wealth, than completing university instead of primary education. So this suggests that family background is absolutely important. So how much support the young people can get from their families is absolutely important. And those who are unlucky and were born in poorer families, they even cannot compensate for the lack of wealthier families, even if they complete university education. So this leads back to the responsibility of the state, indeed, to offer equal opportunities. And the education system has to be improved tremendously, both the practical education and also access to higher education. And certainly, we always talk about spending, and yes, the government should spend more on education, on social support, on job support and everything. But this spending has to be financed from some sources. Until public debt is low, we can just borrow from the market, and especially if interest rates are low, then it seems that government borrowing is a kind of free lunch. But this will not be like this forever. And also a number of member states already have much higher debt. So more taxes are needed sooner or later. And in my view, clearly taxes related to wealth and inheritance are the most fair types of taxes. So when we talk about fiscal policy, we not just have to talk about on what fiscal policy should spend on, but also how to collect additional revenues for the spending. And in this regard, in my view, wealth and inheritance taxes have a great potential, and also would help equalize opportunities, especially for poorer families. So let me stop here, and I look forward to participating in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to follow up later on the wealth and inheritance taxes, because it's a very interesting point. But later on, so on the other round, because I find this topic very interesting. Bensley, hi, from UNDP. Wanted to ask you on a more general issue, also getting after one of the arguments that Schultz made about inequalities. So something we are probably by many statistical data, statistics and data that we see, that probably we're going to go we're going to be after this crisis a bit more unequal than we were just before it. And this means also unequal in terms of education, in terms of the possibilities that young people have. And given that we have, worsening prospects of long-term growth because of demographics in the European Union and also in other places of the world, and the climate crisis, and what we have to do in order to stop stop basically the planet from melting and some of the in the future. What kind of a different, is it, a different new paradigm, for example, of things that we have to do because we're more unequal, we have, more state in terms of regulation and decisions. What kind of, European or also global system are we going into, which is supposed to be better in order to facilitate and be resilient to other shocks? Ben?
Okay, well, thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. I must apologize for the fact that I can't show myself. I have a problem with my camera in my laptop, but since I've been sheltering in place for almost a year now, I'm really not much to look at, so perhaps it's just as well. So, bardzo dziękuję za zaproszenie I przepraszam za niedostatki techniczne z mojej strony. Let me pick up on a few things that have been said. This is a really interesting paper, and I think to really say something useful, one would need to know a bit more about some of the technical aspects of this, the model, how the variables are specified, the data sets, et cetera. So I'll confine my remarks just to the sort of more non-technical aspects, which in fact is what the points that you've raised, Piotr. Indeed, it's now clear that the pandemic is exacerbating inequalities, but I think it's important to point out that it's primarily doing this within countries and perhaps not so much across countries. And I say this because it's interesting that most of the impact globally of the pandemic, in terms of just the health impact, seems to be concentrated in the OECD countries. The country with the greatest number of deaths, both total and in many respects, I believe, per capita, is the United States, right? We have similar problems and trends in a number of European countries, whereas some countries that have reported almost no deaths are countries that are lower middle income or even low income, be this in South Asia, or Africa in some places. Now, maybe this is data problems, but what we do see is within countries, we see the inequalities getting worse, and that's been the point's already been made about this. It revolves very much around people who are working in sectors that can easily use technology to minimize the impact of the pandemic. And if you're working in tech, you're fine. If you're working in the informal sector, you're in big trouble. And from this will come, I think, many inequalities. And this has shown a light on some of the broader drivers of inequalities in many countries. And I think one of the emerging conclusions about this, about inequalities and how the pandemic is exacerbating them, is that in a lot of ways, the policy frameworks are all wrong. We know that much of many inequalities have roots in labor markets, and that effectively redistribute income away from labor and towards capital. And yet taxes on capital in so much of the world have been declining, and taxes on labor have been growing. Not explicitly necessarily, but driven by the desire to ensure that state pension funds are financially sustainable. Social security taxes are rising. And so we have a situation in which an employer who could automate and replace labor with a robot or AI or some other form of technology to purchase the robot, pays the value-added tax, and done. Whereas to hire an additional worker is looking at higher payroll taxes on that worker for every year as long as that worker is employed. Economists are always about getting the prices right? Well, there's a case where arguably the prices of labor and capital are wrong, and we're wondering about why there's not enough employment growth and why there's growing inequality in the labor market. Likewise, if we look at the energy sectors, we don't have prices for carbon, but we do have subsidies for fossil fuels in so many countries. Again, what are the price mechanisms and what are the inequality implications of this? I'd like to briefly touch on a few other issues that perhaps are relevant to the discussion that haven't come up here. We don't yet know this, but I think there are indications that there will be significant demographic implications of the pandemic. We see this, for example, in terms of declining birth rates. 2020 data are beginning to show significant declines in birth rates for countries that have begun to report them, and it's not hard to see why. Is this a blip that will be quickly corrected, or will it be a longer-term trend that will have longer-term demographic challenges, implications? I think likewise, we're just beginning to get a handle on what a year and a half or 2 years of the schools not taking in-class learning, working, how that's going to affect labor markets for scarring and longer-term productivity loss. This is a point, of course, that has been mentioned, and it's a very important one. I think a point that's not mentioned when we look at issues of youth and youth impacted by the pandemic is in many countries, and especially in Europe, youth problems are very significant, but youth are a shrinking portion, demographically, a shrinking age cohort of society as a whole. And it's as these societies increasingly age, the problems of youth perhaps don't have the same political economy weight behind them. If this pandemic had happened in the 1970s or 80s, when societies were so much younger, the problems of youth would necessarily have received greater political economy emphasis because there were so many more young people, relatively speaking, compared to the elderly in these countries, the elderly in the world, I should say, and certainly in Europe. And I think these are problems that youth will face with the pandemic when they are severely impacted, and yet their overall demographic and political weight is not what it was, say, a generation ago. And then perhaps one final point to mention is issues of migration and brain drain, which are relevant certainly for many developing countries, but also within the European Union and for countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, etc. We know that if there's a freer labor migration, it can offset many of the problems, negative implications for growth associated with demographics, aging, etc. And yet, when we look at the new member states of the European Union, those that joined in 2004, 7, or 13, we don't see great interest, even less than in the EU 12 or 15, in receiving migrants. And this is potentially a growth issue to look at. It's also something that affects young people, perhaps disproportionately, because young people are more likely to move, but they're also more likely to return, either if migration doesn't go well or if because situations improve in their home countries. And one of the interesting things has been, prior to the pandemic, so many young people had been returning to Central Europe after gaining skills and higher incomes in other parts of Europe. In some countries, the pandemic has accelerated that returning brain gain, if you like, trend. in others perhaps less so. So I think these are all issues that we may wish to look at when we look at inequalities, when we look at the impact of the pandemic on the labor force, on longer term productivity, and ultimately on the long-term socioeconomic impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ben. Bardzo dziękuję. I want to go now to Justyna. We also, talk about the education system and how to. There are many people saying that we can use this as a way to modernize the educational system. This was one of the key points made by many educators before that. The schooling system, how we teach kids, how we test them, it doesn't work, and it's not going to work in the 21st century, and it's probably going to do more damage than actually, help them in order to work. The sad, realization of the fact, which was pointed out by Ben, that this topic doesn't have that much economic policy clout because of the decreasing number of the youth, is probably the reason why we don't see something like that happening. But after 2008, we talked about a lost generation. Many, probably even us, meaning the panel here, wrote about the issue connected with the lost generation. How to better prepare the educational system. So, do you have something optimistic to say? What we can do actually on a national level and possibly even on the international one?
I think that there is a lot to be done still. So we may have an optimistic view and approach because we may succeed in this way. First of all, when we think about the future, we must think about a 10-year-old girl right now. And thinking about what to do or what should be done, we should think about, for example, my daughter, who is now 8 years old. And just to implement some changes, we need 2 decades to make them real working in our social world. So thinking about future, let's think about kids that are now in the primary school and how to optimize their education just to make success or just to I don't know, change the education into the good direction. So you've already mentioned a lot of, I think, very interesting ideas how to improve our system of education. But first of all, I think that our system is still anachronic. And so to say, we teach our students also, because I'm an academic lecturer, so I also observe our program in the sociology, in the Institute of Sociology. It's like, there are separate boxes of themes, of subjects that we teach. And I think that this project approach will be one of the options to somehow make our system of education more applicable to the labor market. But once I was really shocked and surprised by a discuss with one of our professors in the institute when we discussed this digital culture and how to prepare our students to the labor market. And this other professor told me, but university is not to prepare students to find their job. University is to broaden your horizons. And of course, I also do agree with this statement, because it's like an academic approach. Let's know everything, like Renaissance and this approach. But I think that we should think that our students and our absolvents will need to find their job on the labor market. So let's rethink, remodel this, this program just to enable them to find it better than the others. When we not inherit a big amount of money and we don't have rich parents or grandparents, we must count on ourselves. So first of all, this pandemic showed that digital skills, digital competences are one of the most important assets right now. We as a Poland are in the 21st or 22nd place among 28 countries in European Union as far as the digital competences are concerned. So sorry to say that, but we've got a lot of work and a lot to be done right now as far as this digital literacy is taken into consideration. So the golden idea is, for example, to upskill our teachers, our students, but ourselves also in digital competencies, which can be an asset on the labor market. Furthermore, when we think about this ideal model of the educational system, I think that we should highly and strictly bound these subjects that we teach at schools with the labor market and with the future jobs and skills that will be needed right now within 10 or 15 years, because abstract teaching, theoretical knowledge is of course important. We have everything in books right now, but we don't teach our kids, our students, how to implement this knowledge into dealing with concrete problems, concrete projects in their lives. And our research also showed that that we won't do our job until the end, because we will need to shift our work, our projects from one project to another. So it won't be a job done from the very beginning to the end of our labor career, but it will be just, I know we hate the word flexibility, but it's needed right now to be open-minded and to be open to reskilling. Everyone read Alvin Toffler telling that the analphabets are those who cannot learn new skills and unlearn the previous ones. But I think that this is the most important method to reshape or remodel our system of education right now. And what pandemic done, and what was optimistic, I think that pandemic showed us that everything is possible. 1-2 years ago, we weren't able to even imagine that learning could be e-learning or remote learning, that we could use our computers to the process of education at schools, at normal primary or secondary schools. But now, like in this anecdote, just if you don't know that something is impossible, you will just do it. And pandemic showed also that it is possible. And also what was, I think, one of the main successes in this pandemic reality, that some mental barriers were also broken. When we talked with our lecturers in our institute in April or March last year, they refused to carry or conduct the lectures via computers, via remote systems, because they wanted to come back to classes and then make a more intensive course, but with class. So they refused to do e-learning. And after half of a year, it was already impossible. And they needed to upskill themselves, and they had no choice, no possibility to do it later or to choose another way of teaching. So the pandemic also forced us to do some steps which were impossible 2-3 years ago. And I think that this was one of the most successes and gains of the pandemic as far as this educational perspective is concerned, that impossible occurred as a possible, or even happened. And of course the transformation, the digital transformation, which was somewhere in the future, it really happens, and we all know that it really happens. So I think that this is an optimistic point of view, that we already know what is going on, we are better prepared, and we broke our barriers, mental barriers, and now we just need to upskill ourselves. We need to teach our students and pupils new skills and new competences, also taking into consideration the labor market, because I totally disagree that university is something that exists somewhere over the rainbow, and here is the labor market, which is something that doesn't go together. We are to prepare our young people, like Christoph, for example, to go and to enter the workplace, although he is already in, but other students and colleagues of Christoph to enter the labor market comfortably and without this risk that we can avoid as the elder ones.
Thank you very much. I have one question from the audience, and it's probably going to be to you, Justina, about the tech skills and general knowledge, but I'm going to ask it after I finish this round. So if anybody else from the audience has a question, so feel free to write one in. I'm very interested of them, and I hope that I'm going to be able to ask them all. So Scholz, you talked about changes in the tax system. I know we're talking about the young generation, but as a little tax geek of the last years, I'm interested. What kind of road should is it a road that all European countries should take? Because for example, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, we don't have that much inheritance. This is probably the first generation of people who managed to earn enough money to give something in inheritance, is giving them away at this moment. So in the 2000s, in the 2025, I actually did a study about this for one of the Polish banks on when this shift of wealth is going to happen, and this is for Poland, according to the last projections by the National Statistical Office. It's just happening. So this is the moment when a lot of those people who are in their 70s and in their 60s, and they give away their flats, the money that they managed to earn during the last years, and also the companies that they've created in this 30 years of capitalism after the change. So how do you look back? Is it an approach universal to all European countries, or this is more of what the West is probably going to do? So introduce more wealth taxes, although some of those countries, as Norway or Britain, for example, have some specific solutions like that.
So the unification of wealth taxes or introduction when such taxes do not exist is a very emotional issue. Now, for example, I hear also very frequently that there are many pensioners in my native country in Hungary who are extremely poor, but somehow they obtained an apartment in a nice place of Budapest, which is now super expensive, but they have very low pensions that they get, and they simply would not be able to service any wealth tax because their actual income is so low, even though they own some quite expensive apartments. And if an introduction of a wealth tax without any correction would simply push those old people out of their loft apartments, as they would need to sell them and move somewhere else. And that old people are much more difficult to move also for mental reasons. This is absolutely a valid concern, and there could be also many other concerns. Yet I think that when we look at from a perspective of financing the public budget, and basically we have to decide which finger to bite. Do we want to increase labor-related taxes? Probably not. I mean, there are many good arguments that labor taxes are quite distortive, in fact, among the most distortive taxes. Do we want to increase capital taxes? This is clearly not the trend. I mean, every country is lowering capital and corporate taxes because they want to attract more and more investment from abroad. In the absence of minimum requirements at least in the European Union, I don't see how there would be a scope for a greater increase or intake from corporate taxes. Do we want to increase tax consumption more? I mean, that's a good idea. I mean, many institutions like the OECD welcomes and put forward good argument, because if someone consumes more, everybody will buy electricity, will buy food, will buy clothes, will go to the cinema once the cinemas will be reopened. So a greater consumption taxes have an appeal. That's indeed a fair point, and countries are indeed aiming to increase consumption taxes, but also consumption taxes are regressive in a sense that poorer people pay a larger share of their income on just consuming basic goods, just from day-to-day living, than rich people who a very large of their income goes to all kinds of savings and they find ways to, at least some of them find ways to put it into savings, after which they pay very limited taxes. So the scope for consumption taxes is there, but it also has a regressive impact. I think nobody wants to increase labor taxes. It's not really possible to increase corporate taxes. So what remains is certainly environmental taxes. Again, I very much welcome. In a study, we looked at the degree or the level of environmental taxes across the European Union, and found that, for example, the most heavily taxed countries like Italy and France, they have tax rates 3 times as high as the lowest tax countries, which includes Hungary, Bulgaria, and some other Central European countries. So there is a great variety in the environmental taxes imposed. And there's also, some degree of reluctance of increasing more environmental taxes, because again, poorer people, they pay a larger share of their income on just heating and of their houses and electricity. So an increase there, a big increase in such taxes, again, could have adverse impacts on poverty and income inequality. And the 5th major possible tax revenue is indeed related to wealth or wealth-related issues like inheritance, and many countries have various kinds of wealth taxes. I mean, almost everywhere that is some form of tax on property. There are taxes on somewhere there are taxes on financial transactions and capital transactions. Somewhere there are taxes on capital gains, both for individuals and corporations. Again, if you look at European countries, we see a great variety. For example, in the United Kingdom, such taxes account for almost 5% of GDP. While let's say in Slovakia and the Czech Republic, Latvia, but also Austria, it accounts for just half of 0.5% of GDP. So there are major differences in wealth-related taxes in European countries. Now, whether there should be a coordinated approach, I mean, the European Commission had a report which called for a coordinated approach a couple of years ago. And in fact, that approach also proposed some special treatment of owner-occupied houses and apartments. But member states simply couldn't agree on that. So this discussion led to nowhere. So it means that, and I'm afraid this will be the case also in the future, because again, prepositions and emotional impacts on discussing taxes, and in particular wealth taxes and in related inheritance taxes are very strong and different across European Union member states. So I'm afraid there will be no way for finding a common ground, a common agreement on that. Nevertheless, as an economist who also spent quite some time on looking at tax issues, both conceptually and also empirically, how they work, how easy to evade them, how effective they are, what are the impacts on both output and on equity. In my conclusion is that wealth and inheritance taxes are the least distortive taxes. They can also be designed in a way which makes evasion very difficult. And certainly, like the old pensioner who owns a rich, expensive apartment in the city center, such cases can be dealt with easily. I mean, for example, tax liability can be accumulated, and at the sad moment when that person passes, her or his children will pay the tax, and therefore that person wouldn't need to move out from the beloved apartment where he spent most of his life. So all of these special difficult cases, in my view, could be handled in a fair way. And my conviction, and I would advise finance ministers to take this road and rethink both wealth, inheritance, and gift taxes.
Okay, thank you very much. Noted. So this is a very, as I said, for me, it's one of the most interesting topics overall. I think we're gonna go in a more coordinated approach in terms of the reforms of the tax systems, or I hope so, after the pandemic. But going back to Ben, you made some strong points on the developments after the pandemic, and also some of the other issues connected with demographic development. And in your work, you also covered the CE countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which become closer and closer to the Western ones in terms of development. So how would you? But there are still some differences. We all know them, and we see them every day. So what kind of development policies would you shape as a person working for the United Nations Development Program, and before in history also advising on some of development policies, which could take also the young person's and the young generations challenge. So the challenge of the Corona generation, and which we currently face in Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and in other countries.
Thank you. Well, this is a great question. I think the answer to the question is a little different if we think of what these countries are actually doing versus what perhaps they should be doing. And linked to that is the question of how we understand the overall European project at this juncture. When you look at the types of policies and policy narratives that come out of Brussels about how Europe and the EU should be responding to the challenges now facing it. There's very much an emphasis on the new Green Deal. There's an emphasis on respecting international agreements or corresponding to international compacts about migration. And you see much less interest, shall we say, in these, in, shall we say, the new member states, Central and Eastern Europe. And then the question is this difference in view rooted in different approaches to economic growth? Is for Poland, for example, is moving away from coal a suicidal economic proposition? Or is it the future? And are there great opportunities associated with this? I think reasonable people disagree on the answer to that question. And you, of course, in the Polish context, have had very vibrant discussions on this. My own sense is that going back to what we said earlier, much of this actually revolves around policies in other areas. If you subsidize fossil fuels and have high taxes on labor, you're going to have a dirty economy that discourages job creation. And if you want to get away from that problem, doing something about reducing subsidies and using the increased revenues to address some of the labor market issues makes a lot of sense, irrespective of how much you buy into the broader Green Deal narrative. In other words, I think if Poland has a comparative advantage in coal, then why does it need to be subsidized? Right? That's the sort of question that probably should be discussed, maybe, or that question could be phrased in some different ways than it's often taken up. And likewise, in terms of migration, Now, of course, migration is an issue in many countries, not just in the new member states, but the obviously different policy and social approaches to migration in places like Hungary, as opposed to some of the Northern and Western European countries, is pretty stark. And when you think about what the growth potential is and drivers of growth in countries with aging, shrinking populations and labor forces, migration is so clearly an answer, if not the answer, especially when there's potential for reverse migration of, for example, many younger Hungarians that have gone abroad and may be interested in going back to Hungary, maybe buying some of those apartments in Budapest that might become available as the elderly people living in them may not be there anymore, to put it as delicately as possible, just to hook into something that Joel said earlier. So I think when we talk about growth and drivers of growth in the European context, there's many different layers to these narratives, and they're very different in different countries. I would say that from a global perspective, however, that the European Union deserves a lot of credit for being really a leader in promoting green economy transition, promoting the kinds of policy changes that are reducing greenhouse gas emissions. The European Union countries as a whole in the last 2 decades have significantly reduced per capita greenhouse gas emissions. And it's one of the best stories of why a green transition is possible. We have seen, in effect, in the EU, the decoupling of economic growth from a carbon-based economy. And that's not, that narrative, while it may be made in Brussels, is not as appreciated in other places as perhaps it could be. And it's something we in the UN very much appreciate, and appreciate the leadership that Europe is showing in this respect. Now, what that means for individual countries within the European Union is arguably a different story. And I think likewise on migration here, we have the Global Compact on Migration. Some European countries have really stepped up to honor their commitments, others less so. But those countries that have, within the framework of EU approach to migration, which is complicated, I think they too deserve credit for the leadership they have shown. And the UN, we're conscious of this as well. So these are areas in which the EU is showing leadership, areas in which, in many respects, this leadership is good for Europe as a whole, but also for the world. And these are perhaps points that are particularly relevant in light of the issues we're discussing here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as I said, we're almost wrapping up. It's almost 1 hour and 30 minutes of our discussion, or a bit more. There's a question, I think, for Justina. So it's an either-or question. Or is it an either-or? Should we teach skills or general knowledge? Because you made that point in your statement. I'm not going to read the whole question. You can answer it, because I saw that you read
I will try to. I will try to either or. I think that, of course, both knowledge and skills are important, but I think that the most important nowadays is the proper attitude, the general approach towards the possible change as far as our work or workplace is concerned. And of course, skills are important and knowledge is also important, but knowledge has this problem that it is very fast out of date. But on the contrary, I've discussed once with Tomasz Gajderowicz, who is a researcher in the Faculty of Economics, and he argued with me that our system of education is not as out of date as we all think, because general knowledge and this open perspective is what we try to teach our students right now. And if we compare our system to other European educational systems, we are we better prepare our students to the future and for the future jobs and skills that they will need than the others. So maybe the optimistic idea is that we are not as worse as we think. But I will say that knowledge is important, skills are important, but the proper attitude, the ability to use this knowledge and skills properly is the most important thing that we should now teach and implement to our students. It is very difficult because knowledge we can just put them, show the book or show the report to read. Skills we can also teach them, but approach or attitude we must socialize them in a special way to open their mind and prepare them for the change, constant flexibility, and so on and so on. And I think that's why I told about this 8 or 10-year-old girl thinking about the future, because I think that we need 2 decades to socialize and to grow up our kids and children in this attitude, which takes into consideration the constant change, flexibility, open mind, and so on and so on. Although these are very naive letters right now, but I do believe that this attitude and this openness will be an asset on the labor market. And I also researched for some some data for you. And once we've prepared a report on the future of work in Poland, and there was one, I think, surprising question, because the vast majority of our respondents were aware of the changes that are coming, automatization, digitization, and other processes in the workplace. But on the other hand, 48% of our respondents were sure that nothing will change within 5 years or 10 or 15 years of their occupation. So we believe that something will change, but it won't touch ourselves and our situation in the job market. And I think this is this attitude I'm talking about, that we, of course, are aware of digital transformation and the revolution that is going on, but we think that it's something not for us and we are not involved in it. So this attitude, taken into consideration that these changes will touch us also, is the most important skill or knowledge we should teach and we should get in our education right now. So to sum up, I think that there is no either or question or answer. Knowledge, skills, everything is important, but I think that attitude, ability, openness, everything what make us more flexible for these changes, which are inevitable. So we must just be aware of the changes that are coming, and that is the recipe for our future and our safe future on the labor market.
Okay, so it's 4:37 at my clock. Probably a bit earlier in the States, so I'm not even going to ask Ben what time is it, but I think this was an optimistic summary of this discussion. So hope for the change, use the change, and probably the system isn't that much broken. I'm hopeful about that, so that it doesn't need to be that much repaired. Shodar was from Bruegel, Justyna Pokojska from the University of Warsaw, from their lab, and also the Faculty of Sociology, Ben Slay of the United Nations Development Program, and I was Peter Arak and Krzysztof Kutwa, the author of the paper. Don't buy it, so you can download it on our webpage. You can also share it with some people you like or you don't like. I don't know, maybe someone tell it's very interesting, and it's not because it's long and it has too many numbers. But I think this is an important discussion, probably more to come when we're going to see the effects of the pandemic, the lockdowns, and what the hybrid and non-hybrid schooling system has made during this time. So thank you very much, and have a nice day or a good evening, depending where you're at. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.